Hi, welcome to this video. This is on material in the first chapter of our textbook, The Habits of Mind of Academic Writers. And I'm just going to walk through some of the main points from this chapter with you and discuss some of my own work since I am an academic. I'm a professional scholar. So I'm going to just provide some of my own work as a little example of um, how these habits of mind work. What is academic writing? So, this is writing that is written by professional scholars that's designed to communicate with others in their discipline. What is a discipline? An academic discipline is a certain area of study that has a certain subject matter and also a certain approach. So, things like psychology, biology, history, philosophy, etc. Basically, the departments of universities are generally built around different disciplines. Um, so these disciplines vary not just in what they study, whether it's like natural phenomenon, the interactions of natural organisms, say, or the workings of the human mind and human behavior. Um, but disciplines also vary in the ways in which scholars approach those things and how they ask questions about them and how they do research. The biologist's research, of course, looks really different from the philosopher's research. And yes, as philosophers, we do research. We don't do it in a lab like the biologists do, but we research a topic by thinking really hard about it, making some observations if there are things to be observed about your topic. And also, we read what others have read on the topic, and we interact with that literature. Um, so, academic writing generally always makes an argument. Academic papers are crafted to persuade an audience, again, usually fellow scholars. We try to persuade one another that our theories or explanations for various phenomena are the best or most correct explanations, and we argue with one another about those things. You are going to be making an argument, especially in your final paper for this class, by doing some of your own research on an issue that you choose. Academic writing happens in a social context. It does not happen in a vacuum. We don't just scurry off to our little cubby holes and work in our own little worlds and not think about what anyone else is thinking. We read each other's work and respond to it, and sometimes in our own work. And so it's a social sort of thing. The book is going to be coming back to this idea over and over again that um, academic writing is a conversation between scholars, and part of our goal in this class is to find ways to enter into that conversation and to make our own contributions. That is what you're going to be doing in your writing in this class. Okay, so habits of mind. These are patterns of, of thought and behavior that um, academic writers practice. And these are things that we are going to try to instill in ourselves in this class as we move forward. These are habits that our textbook regards as very important for academic writers and things we should strive to put into practice ourselves. So, first habit is academic writers make inquiries. Um, how does this work? Well, it begins first with observation. Um, Academics, depending on their discipline, observe different kinds of things going on in the world and record their observations in various ways and then seek to understand those observations. We ask questions about the things we observe. So the biologist maybe looks at, say, a certain response that an organism makes towards something and asks, why does it respond in that way? Why not in some other way? Um, a chemist might look at the interaction of two chemical substances and think, okay, why does it happen that way and not otherwise? As philosophers, we observe all kinds of phenomenon, whether it's things about people or about the natural world, and ask philosophical questions about them, which are a little different than what the scientist does. But the point is that all academic writers, we start with questions. We don't just start by assuming the things that we know and go forward. We look at really hard at things and ask, okay, what don't I know about this? What don't we know as a community about this phenomenon, and how could we go further? And academics consider alternatives, so they don't only look at, okay, here's the way things are. They also consider how things could be otherwise. This will vary in terms of the discipline. Some disciplines are what we might say critical, right? They don't just look at the world around them, but they think, especially if we're looking at the social world or the political world, ask questions like, do things have to be this way? Do people's attitudes and behaviors have to take these courses, or could it be otherwise? Are there things we could do to change our political and social world and make it better? Okay, so at this point, I'm going to switch over here and just to illustrate some of this, my own example. So here is a paper. This is the first big paper that I had published. As I said, I'm a philosopher, and my area of philosophy is philosophy of art, specifically the philosophy of music. This sometimes is called aesthetics, the philosophy of art. And this is a journal called the Journal of Aesthetics and Art Criticism. And my paper, as you can see here, is on what we call cover versions in rock music, right? That's a performance of a song that is that someone else has done previous to you. And so I first off started by observing the phenomenon in the rock world, not just of cover versions, but of covers where the genre, the style of music of the cover is very different from that of the original. So in my first paragraph here, I consider an example of that. It's a cover that the Sex Pistols did in 1979 of the song My Way, which was sung and popularized by Frank Sinatra in the late 60s. So for those of you who might know this song, the Sinatra version is a very lush, kind of croony ballad that you might hear, in Las Vegas or, on your grandma's record player. And the Sex Pistols, of course, were a big landmark punk band in the late 70s, and so their version is in the punk rock style. So pretty dramatic shift in genre. So I not only observed, the Sex Pistols cover, but I saw that this is actually really common in rock music. And so in this next paragraph here, I give a whole big list of genre reset covers that other people have done. Jimi Hendrix covered Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower. Limp Bizkit covered George Michael. There's a bluegrass band called Hayseed Dixie that does hard rock songs in a bluegrass style. So there are a lot of examples of this, and so I asked questions about this phenomenon. So my questions were mostly things like, why is this so widespread and prevalent? Why is this such a common practice in rock? Why does this seem to be so popular? What is it about covers that change the genre that we seem to like so much and that artists seem to enjoy doing so much? So those are the questions that I asked about what I was observing in the music world. I didn't do too much of examining alternatives in my paper. My paper was mostly just trying to be descriptive. But again, not all philosophers just describe or seek to explain things. In particular, philosophers who do ethics or the study of morality, a lot of times not only try to understand why we do what we do, but think of how we can do better, right? Think of how our actions can be more morally good. So even though I did not really examine alternatives in this paper, it's something that a lot of philosophers do, and that a lot of scholars in other disciplines do as well. Okay, so getting back to our PowerPoint. So the next habit of mind is that academic writers seek and value complexity. In other words, we don't just kind of take things at face value and accept a simple answer when we ask a question. We try to dig deep below the surface and really explore the nitty-gritty of that phenomenon and see what makes it, interesting and complex. The more complex the problem, the more academics like it. So that means we don't just make observations, we reflect on them, we think hard about them, we consider all the various possibilities that are going on there. We examine an issue from multiple perspectives. We think how others may see it. We consider what others have written about it previously, or we think just how it might look differently when we approach it from different points of view. Academics avoid binary thinking. Binary thinking is just basically the view that there can only be two sides to an issue, that things fall into simple categories of pro and con, or right and wrong, good and bad, kind of black and white. In general, that's a very simple way to look at things. Academics prefer to look at a more complex picture where there's more than just two sides. There are many sides, things that fall in between different categories, different shades of gray, not just black and white. And lastly, we ask issue-based questions. By an issue-based question here, we mean when we're looking at an issue, that's something that people could reasonably disagree about and debate about, and that multiple opposing but rational answers could be given to it. Issues are, the only things that academics see as worth writing about, right? And we can see why. If it's an issue like, if we're going to consider the question, is murder morally wrong? That doesn't seem to be much of an issue, right? There are not going to be many people that disagree with that statement, that disagree with murder being morally wrong. So it's not going to be a very interesting issue to explore. We would need to explore, say, different cases in which, say, cases of self-defense or killing that's carried out during wartime, right? Those are things that people could disagree about the moral value of that thing. Again, complex issues where people can take up different sides. That's what we seek out. Okay. The third habit is that academic writers see writing as a conversation. So here we are, this idea of conversation again. So what does this mean? Well, it means we respond to and build upon earlier ideas. We recognize and acknowledge that we're not writing in a vacuum. We're not the first people to have ever thought carefully about and studied problems. And so we acknowledge the work that has been done before, and we try to build on it. We might disagree with some of what has come before us, or we might agree with it partially. We might agree with it altogether, but think, okay, we just need to go further. So regularly, scientists in a lot of different of the scientific fields have to include what they call a literature review in their papers. So this is where they go through and say, all right, here's all the relevant research that's already been done in this area. And so they acknowledge what others have done before, and in the end say, okay, but there's still work to be done. Here's a gap in the research, and that's where my work comes in. All right. So we also, this is at least something that most academics should do, and we strive to do. We don't always succeed, but we respect and strive to understand other points of view. The book calls this the practice of empathy. Right? Empathy is trying to understand something from another person's point of view. Look at things from their vantage point. So we, even with positions that we disagree with, we respect that point of view, take it seriously, and strive to understand it, even if we're going to ultimately end up arguing against it. This is something that philosophers have to do a lot because we're a very argumentative bunch. We debate and argue and disagree a lot, but we try to always do it in a way where we're taking the other side seriously and respectfully. We engage critically with others' ideas, so this means we take that other side seriously, but that we also part of taking it seriously is actually seeing the ways in which it might be flawed, where it could be wrong, and we consider, was that a good response? Was that a good argument? And we go from there with our own work. It also requires that one be flexible in your thinking, so you're receptive and open to the other's point of view, to the degree that it could even let the other's ideas change your own ideas. Sometimes, as scholars and just good students, right, we need to be open to the idea that others might have, something to teach us, often a lot to teach us, and that even people we disagree with initially, we might find ourselves in the end changing our minds and maybe coming to see things their way on some points. So being an academic is not just about being stubborn and sticking your ground no matter what. We strive to learn from others. And of course, this is something that just as people we should try to do and as good students. But it's very important in academic writing. So just to give you an idea of the forms this can take, in my own work, I, as a lot of philosophers do, when I set up a paper, I acknowledge the work that others have done before me. So in this case, I talk about, right at the beginning here, I mention a pretty big scholar of rock music in the philosophy world. His name's Theodore Graczyk, and he wrote the first big book-length treatment of rock from a philosophical point of view back in the 90s. And so right in the beginning you see here, I acknowledge him and his theory, and I even start off by agreeing with him. So I say, in discussing rock music, I adopt a definition of this category, first proposed by Theodore Graczyk, quote, a tradition of popular music, as opposed to a genre or style, whose creation and dissemination centers on recording technology. So I acknowledge Grachik's idea here that rock is a kind of music that's centered on recording, and that way it differs from both classical music and folk and jazz. And I agree with him, and I kind of move from there and build on his ideas. So that is one way in which I guess I'm demonstrating the conversational nature here of rock. I'm hearing what someone says, I agree, and then I make my own contribution after I do that. But the conversational point can come out even more explicitly in certain cases. So here's a piece that that a philosopher wrote in response to me, and as you can see, it came out in the same journal about a year later. This was written by a philosopher named Lee Brown, who has since passed away, sadly, but he read my article and liked it, but found things that he disagreed with, and so he wrote this piece called A Critique of Michael Ring's on Covers, where he offered some objections and some challenges to my idea, but also he sought to really try to understand what I was doing. So just to note, first off, the general tone here. First off, he starts off by saying that he'd had similar ideas about covers at one point, and my article kind of beat him to the punch. And you see here he says a nice article on the topic by Michael Rings, for instance. So even though he's going to end up disagreeing with me, he does call it a nice article. And he's not just being polite here. He does actually go on to say a lot of complimentary things about my ideas and how I approach my subject matter, even as he disagrees with it. And toward the end of his paper, he even is trying to, really understand what I'm doing in my article. And he says here, perhaps then Rings's perspective provides an analysis not of covers in general, but rather of a more specific concept, namely saturatedly elusive genre resetting covers. I can just show you how dense and technical philosophical language can get, like a lot of academic writing. But he was, trying to offer his own interpretation of what he thought I was doing. So he's taking it seriously and he's striving to understand it. He's practicing empathy. And I then had the chance to respond back to him. So the journal contacted me and let me know about Brown's piece and said, we'd like to invite you to write your own response and we'll publish that in the same issue. So here we have, the back and forth continues, and here's my response to him. Again, I just want to note my tone here. I want to thank Lee Brown for his insightful and thought-provoking commentary on my work. It's challenged me to be more articulate, etc. So again, notice the tone of respect here, and also I am acknowledging the good things about what he's done here. Even if I end up disagreeing with him, and I do thank him for his work, which was thought-provoking and just made me think harder and have to get clearer on my own views. So that is just one way in which the conversation can really play out in very very much a back and forth kind of way. But it of course happens all over the place in college, right? We have conversations in the classroom. Academics go to conferences and present papers to one another, and have conversations about them there. And conversations, of course, happen on the page like this. Okay, so excuse me. All right. So the last habit of mind is that academic writers understand that writing is a process. And we in this class are going to understand writing as a process, something that requires a lot of steps, not just a feverish dash to the deadline and writing your paper, starting your paper at midnight the night before it's due, right? So what are the steps that academics go through? Well, first we collect information and material. For my paper, I collected information on covers. I collected a whole bunch of examples of covers where the genre is switched. And then I also read philosophy that others had written before me on this topic, namely theater, the work of Theodor Gracek and other scholars. Of course, this changes depending on the discipline, right? The geologists, the biologists, they go and make observations and collect material from the natural world before they start their project. We draft and we draft again. So we make multiple drafts of our papers, and I'll show you in a second how many I had to go through for my own paper. We revise significantly, so we don't just clean up our grammar and our spelling in a quick edit before we finish up. We make dramatic changes in the content and structure of what we've done in order to improve our arguments. We especially have to do this when we get feedback from other scholars. I had to do that a lot in my paper. So just to give you an idea here, here is a folder that I created over many years that's just on the paper I showed you, the paper I showed you and the follow-up discussion with Lee Brown. So as you can see here, there are many, I even have subfolders in here. There are subfolders, there are many documents. My paper was published in 2013 in, I think it was 2013 in that journal after I had submitted it in 2011. But the first time I wrote it was actually back in 2008. I think this is probably my first draft right here. I wrote it in 2008 for a conference where I presented it. So it was many years and many drafts and redrafts and revisions later that I finally got it published. So you can see I did one draft in 2008. I presented the paper. I got some feedback on it. I drafted it again in 2009. I submitted it. This BJA is the British Journal of Aesthetics. I submitted it to that journal. That happened in 2010. It was rejected. I then submitted it to the Journal of Aesthetics. I'm not sure. Let's see where that one is. I think it's somewhere here. Oh, there it is. This, I think, was my third submission. I made that in 2012. I think I made another submission to Jack in 2011. So it went through a lot of different revisions. I got feedback from other scholars who read my work and made dramatic revisions. You can see I also have all kinds of other things here too. I have notes that I started taking out early on to just brainstorm through ideas on how to approach this. I then also made a big list of covers. Here's a list just of possible examples, covers that change the genre. And I put together a pretty big list. By the end, I maybe had over 50 songs. Um, so I was doing just a lot of initial note taking and brainstorming and research even before I started writing. Um, but you can see it took a whole lot to get this paper finally into a journal. Of course, you're not going to be doing anything this extensive in this class. We're not trying to create professional journal articles here, but just to show you that academics, we don't just sit down and produce something, brilliant and polished the first time. We have to go back to the drawing board again and again and draft again and again and again. So that is all just part of the process of writing and of good writing. And we're going to be doing a bit of that in this class here. So, thank you for watching. We'll be talking about this, of course, more in class and as we continue this semester, this quarter. So, thank you, and I'll be seeing you in class.